The rotors hadn't even settled when the first voice crackled through the radio. "Negative, command. We're not getting on that bird." The words cut through the Afghanistan darkness like a blade, spoken with the kind of authority that comes from surviving 97 combat missions. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Bone Rodriguez keyed his mic again, his voice carrying the weight of 8 years leading SEAL Team 7. "I repeat, negative on extraction. We'll wait for backup." 300 meters away, perched on a ridge that overlooked the Kunar Province Valley, Captain Kai Ghost Nakamura adjusted her night vision goggles and watched the drama unfold below. The MH-60M Black Hawk she just set down in a postage stamp landing zone was still bleeding hydraulic fluid from the emergency landing that had brought her here in the first place. But that wasn't why the SEALs were refusing to board. They couldn't see her from their position, couldn't see the pilot's helmet silhouetted against the green glow of the cockpit instruments, but somehow they knew. Word traveled fast in the special operations community, and Ghost's reputation had preceded her into this god-forsaken corner of the Hindu Kush. The mystery wasn't why they knew her call sign. Every JSOC aviator worth their wings had heard the stories. The mystery was why Command had sent her on what should have been a routine extraction, and why those same stories that made hardened operators respect her name also made them question getting into her aircraft. Because Ghost didn't just fly helicopters, she collected them. Not as trophies, but as temporary homes for the missions nobody else would take, the extractions nobody else could execute, and the pilots nobody else could save when everything went sideways at 30,000 feet. Tonight's mission had started simple: extract a recon element after their surveillance operation in the Korangal Valley. But nothing stayed simple when Ghost was involved, and the fact that she was here, in person, flying a bird that looked like it had been through a blender, meant something had gone catastrophically wrong with the primary extraction. The question hanging in the mountain air wasn't whether the SEALs would eventually get on her helicopter. They would, because they were professionals and they wanted to go home. The question was what had happened to the original extraction team, and why the most experienced helicopter pilot in JSOC was personally flying what appeared to be a suicide mission. Rodriguez keyed his mic again, but this time his voice carried a different weight. "Ghost, this is Bone. We need to talk before we board your bird." From her position in the cockpit, Kai smiled beneath her helmet. The conversation was about to get interesting. The legend of Ghost began 18 months earlier in a valley not far from this one, when a routine supply run turned into the kind of story that gets whispered in ready rooms and briefing tents across 3 continents. But legends, like helicopters, have a way of carrying more weight than they appear to handle, and tonight would prove whether Kai Nakamura was the pilot the stories claimed she was, or simply another aviator who had flown too close to the myth. The radio crackled again. "Ghost Bone, we've got wounded. How bad is your bird?" The question hung in the static-filled air like a challenge, and for the first time in her career, Captain Kai Nakamura wasn't entirely sure she had an answer. The hydraulic system was failing, the tail rotor was throwing vibrations that made her teeth ache, and she could taste metal in her mouth every time she worked the collective. But she'd flown worse aircraft in worse conditions, and the SEALs below had been in the field for 6 days without resupply. "Bone, Ghost, bird's got issues, but she'll fly. Question is whether you trust me to get you home." The honesty in her voice was deliberate. These weren't regular infantry who could be reassured with pilot bravado. These were operators who had seen enough helicopter crashes to know the sound of an aircraft on borrowed time. The silence stretched for 30 seconds, which in tactical time felt like an eternity. Ghost used the pause to run through her mental checklist: fuel state, weapons load, emergency procedures, and the weight calculations that would determine whether 6 SEALs and their equipment could make it back to Bagram without the helicopter falling out of the sky. The mathematics were ugly, but not impossible. The weather was deteriorating, but still manageable. The real variable was the one she couldn't calculate. whether her reputation would convince these operators to trust their lives to a pilot they'd never flown with, in an aircraft that sounded like a washing machine full of rocks. "Ghost, this is Blackjack 6. The new voice on the radio was calm, measured, and carried the quiet authority of a senior officer who had made harder decisions than this one. Lieutenant Colonel James Blackjack Morrison was the squadron commander who had personally signed off on tonight's mission, and his presence on the radio meant the stakes were higher than anyone had initially briefed. Weather window is closing in 15 minutes. After that, nobody flies until dawn." The message was clear without being stated. Get on the helicopter now, or spend the night in Indian country with Taliban fighters who had been tracking the SEAL element for the past 48 hours. Ghost knew the terrain, knew the tactical situation, and knew that dawn was still 8 hours away. The SEALs knew it too, which made their continued reluctance to board her aircraft even more significant. "Blackjack 6, Bone. Request 5 minutes to assess the bird." Rodriguez's voice had shifted into the professional tone that preceded either cooperation or mutiny, and Ghost found herself genuinely curious which direction the next few minutes would take. She'd flown hundreds of combat extractions, but never one where the passengers had essentially refused her services before meeting her face to face. Rodriguez's boots hit the rocky ground 60 seconds later, his rifle held in the patrol-ready position as he moved through the darkness toward Ghost's aircraft. He was followed by his team medic, a compact operator whose call sign Doc had been earned through 3 deployments and more trauma surgeries than most civilian doctors see in a decade. Together, they represented the kind of quiet professionalism that made SEAL Team 7 one of the most effective direct action units in the command. Ghost shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, her flight suit bearing the subdued patches that identified her as both a pilot and a captain in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. At 5 feet 6 inches, she was smaller than most of her passengers expected, but her movements carried the economy and precision that comes from 5,000 hours of flying helicopters in places where mistakes are measured in body bags rather than paperwork. "Captain," Rodriguez said, his voice neutral as he extended a gloved hand, "heard a lot of stories about you." "Most of them are probably true," Ghost replied, shaking his hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive. "Question is whether you believe the good ones or the bad ones." The conversation that followed would later be described by Doc as the most honest pre-flight briefing he'd ever witnessed. Ghost laid out the aircraft's mechanical issues with the kind of technical detail that demonstrated both her competence and her respect for the SEAL's intelligence. She didn't sugarcoat the hydraulic leak or minimize the tail rotor vibrations, but she also explained why the aircraft was still flyable and how she planned to compensate for each system degradation. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as Ghost described flight profiles and emergency procedures that most infantry soldiers wouldn't understand, but that made perfect sense to an operator who had flown enough missions to recognize pilot competence when he heard it. When she finished, he looked at Doc, who shrugged and said simply, "She knows her aircraft." "That's not the question," Rodriguez replied, his eyes never leaving Ghost's face. "Question is whether she knows when to say no." The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke, and Ghost recognized it for what it was, not a test of her flying ability, but of her judgment. The SEALs weren't questioning her skills. They were questioning whether she was the kind of pilot who would kill herself and her passengers trying to prove a point, or the kind who would make the hard decisions that keep people alive. "I've said no plenty of times," Ghost said quietly, "including twice this month when aircraft commanders thought they could push birds beyond their limits." She paused, looking up at the mountain ridges that surrounded them. "But I've never said no when the tactical situation required a risk that was calculated rather than stupid." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "And tonight?" "Tonight's calculated," Ghost replied. "Barely, but calculated." The extraction began 3 minutes later, with Rodriguez's team loading their wounded teammate onto Ghost's aircraft, while she completed a abbreviated pre-flight inspection that focused on the systems most likely to fail during the 40-minute flight back to Bagram. The wounded SEAL, a sniper whose call sign, Longshot, had been earned through confirmed kills at distances most people couldn't see, was conscious, but had taken shrapnel to his left leg during the firefight that had necessitated the emergency extraction. Doc worked with practiced efficiency to stabilize Longshot for transport, while Ghost calculated weight distribution and fuel consumption rates that would determine their flight profile back to base. The mathematics were unforgiving. Too much weight would prevent them from achieving the altitude necessary to clear the mountain ridges, while too little fuel would leave them walking home through terrain controlled by an enemy who had already demonstrated their willingness to engage American forces. "Ghost, we're loaded," Rodriguez reported over the internal communications system, his voice carrying the kind of quiet tension that preceded every helicopter insertion or extraction in combat zones. The other SEALs had settled into positions that would allow them to provide defensive fire if necessary while maintaining the aircraft's center of gravity within acceptable parameters. Ghost acknowledged with a brief nod and began the startup sequence that would transform the damaged Black Hawk from a potential death trap into a flying machine capable of crossing 30 miles of hostile territory. The engine spooled up with a sound that was part mechanical precision and part barely controlled explosion, while the rotor blades began their slow rotation toward the disk that would lift 8 souls out of the Afghanistan darkness. But as Ghost pulled collective and felt the aircraft transition from ground effect to actual flight, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten with concern. The tail rotor vibrations weren't just annoying anymore, they were getting worse, and at their current rate of deterioration, she had perhaps 20 minutes before the helicopter became unflyable. The question was whether 20 minutes would be enough to cover the distance to safety, or whether she was about to give Rodriguez and his team a very compelling reason to doubt the stories they'd heard about Ghost. The flight path home took them through valleys that had been fought over by Soviet forces in the 1980s, by Northern Alliance troops in the 1990s, and by American and coalition forces for the past decade. Ghost flew the route from memory, adjusting altitude and airspeed to account for the helicopter's degraded performance while maintaining the tactical profile that would minimize their exposure to ground fire. The landscape below was beautiful in the way that only truly dangerous places can be, ancient and unforgiving, carved by wind and water into shapes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Rodriguez moved forward to the cockpit area, plugging his communications headset into the intercom system that allowed private conversation between crew and passengers. "How we doing up here, Ghost?" His question was casual, but Ghost could hear the concern underneath the professional demeanor. "Tail rotor's getting worse," she replied honestly, "but we've got options if it fails completely." The options she didn't mention were all variations on controlled crash landing, but Rodriguez was experienced enough to understand the implications without having them spelled out. "Copy that," he said. "Team's ready for whatever comes next." The simple statement carried more weight than most civilians would understand. In the special operations community, trust was earned through shared risk and demonstrated competence, and Rodriguez's acknowledgement that his team was prepared to follow Ghost's lead represented the kind of professional respect that couldn't be faked or forced. They were committed to the flight now, for better or worse, and Ghost felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with carrying other people's lives in her hands. 15 minutes into the flight, the hydraulic system finally gave up entirely, transforming the Black Hawk's controls from power-assisted precision into manual labor that required both arms and considerable upper body strength to maintain straight and level flight. Ghost compensated by reducing airspeed and accepting a flight profile that was less tactically sound but more mechanically sustainable, while Doc continued to monitor Longshot's vital signs and provide updates that helped Ghost calculate how much time they had before medical considerations overtook mechanical ones. "Ghost, Blackjack 6, the radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Weather's closing in faster than forecast. You've got maybe 10 minutes of flyable conditions at Bagram." The news was bad but not unexpected. Afghanistan weather was notoriously unpredictable, and the storm system that had been tracking toward their area had apparently accelerated. Ghost acknowledged the transmission while running through contingency plans that ranged from uncomfortable to catastrophic, settling on a flight profile that would get them to Bagram with approximately 3 minutes to spare if nothing else went wrong. Rodriguez had been listening to the radio traffic, and when Ghost glanced back at him, she saw the kind of expression that she'd learned to associate with experienced operators who were calculating odds and didn't like the mathematics they were discovering. "What's the backup plan?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned that Murphy's Law was actually an understatement when it came to military operations. "Don't need one," Ghost replied, her hands working the collective and cyclic controls with movements that looked effortless but required constant attention to the helicopter's deteriorating mechanical systems. "We're going to make it." The confidence in her voice was partly real and partly theater, because she knew that Rodriguez and his team needed to believe they would survive the next 20 minutes. But the truth was more complicated. They would make it to Bagram because the alternative was unacceptable, and Ghost had built a career on refusing to accept alternatives that ended with American casualties in foreign countries. The storm hit them 8 minutes from base, transforming the Afghanistan night from merely dangerous into actively hostile. Rain lashed the windscreen with enough force to overwhelm the wipers, while wind gusts tried to push the damaged helicopter into flight attitudes that would have been challenging for a healthy aircraft, and were potentially fatal for one operating on backup systems and manual controls. Ghost compensated by dropping altitude until they were flying barely 50 feet above the rocky terrain, using visual references and GPS navigation to maintain course, while the storm tried to drive them into the mountains that bracketed their approach to Bagram. The low altitude made defensive maneuvering impossible, but it also kept them below the worst of the wind shear that was turning the upper atmosphere into a blender. Doc's voice cut through the noise of rain and failing machinery. "Longshot's pressure is dropping. He needs a hospital, not a field medic." The message was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that medics use when time is running out, and Ghost felt another variable added to an equation that was already pushing the boundaries of what was mathematically possible. "Bagram, Ghost Rider 11, emergency inbound," she transmitted, using the formal call sign that would alert the tower that her aircraft was in serious trouble. "Hydraulic failure, wounded on board, requesting priority handling." "Ghost Rider 11, Bagram Tower, cleared for emergency approach runway 27. Crash and rescue standing by." The phrase "crash and rescue standing by" was not something any pilot wanted to hear, but it also meant that ground personnel were prepared for the possibility that Ghost's aircraft might not make it to the runway in a conventional manner. The emergency crews knew her reputation, knew that aircraft bearing the Ghost Rider call sign had a tendency to arrive at their base in conditions that challenged the normal definition of flyable. Rodriguez moved back to his team, checking weapons and equipment with the kind of automatic precision that experienced operators display when they're preparing for possibilities they don't want to contemplate. If Ghost managed to get them to Bagram safely, they would walk away from the aircraft and resume their normal duties. If she didn't, they would implement survival procedures that had been drilled into them through years of training and multiple combat deployments. Ghost lined up for final approach with movements that were part flying skill and part mechanical sympathy, coaxing performance from systems that were operating well beyond their design parameters. The runway lights cut through the storm like a promise of safety, while the tail rotor vibrations had evolved from annoying to genuinely frightening. She had perhaps 2 minutes before mechanical failure transitioned from possible to inevitable. "Gears down and locked," she announced, going through landing procedures that had become automatic after 5,000 hours of flying helicopters in conditions that ranged from challenging to impossible. "Approach speed steady, descent rate nominal." The words were technically accurate, but didn't convey the full reality of what it took to maintain nominal performance from an aircraft that was essentially flying on determination and spare parts. Ghost's hands moved constantly on the controls, making minute adjustments that prevented the helicopter from transitioning into flight attitudes that would be difficult to recover from. The touchdown was firm but controlled, with Ghost using ground effect and manual control inputs to settle the Black Hawk onto the Bagram runway, with the kind of precision that made it look easier than it actually was. The emergency crews moved toward the aircraft before the rotors had even stopped turning, while Doc and Rodriguez worked together to transfer Longshot from the helicopter to the medical personnel who would take over his care. Ghost completed her shutdown procedures with movements that were economical and professional, but Rodriguez noticed that her hands were shaking slightly as she secured the aircraft systems. The flight had been more challenging than she had let on, and the relief in her expression was visible now that her passengers were safely on the ground. "Hell of a ride, Ghost," Rodriguez said as he approached the cockpit, his voice carrying the kind of respect that comes from shared survival. "Team owes you one." Ghost looked up at him, her helmet off and her hair plastered with sweat despite the cool Afghanistan air. "No debt," she replied quietly. "That's what we do." But as she walked away from the aircraft that had brought them home, Ghost knew that tonight's mission had been different somehow. Not because of the mechanical failures or the weather or even the tactical challenges they had overcome together. Different because for the first time in her career, she had flown with passengers who had initially refused to trust her, and had earned that trust through performance rather than reputation. The Black Hawk sat on the runway behind her, leaking fluids and looking like it had been through a war, which Ghost reflected it had. They all had, but they had made it home, and in the special operations community, that was the only metric that mattered. The stories would come later, told in ready rooms and briefing tents where operators gathered to share the kind of experiences that couldn't be written in after-action reports. But tonight, Ghost was content to walk through the rain toward the operations center, knowing that somewhere behind her, a helicopter crew chief was looking at her aircraft and shaking his head in amazement that it had managed to fly at all. The real story wasn't that Ghost had successfully completed another impossible mission. The real story was that she had done it while earning the trust of passengers who had started the night believing she was too dangerous to fly with. Rodriguez found her an hour later in the operations center, filling out the paperwork that would document the night's mission for official records. The forms were standard military bureaucracy: fuel consumption, mechanical discrepancies, personnel transported, but they couldn't capture the reality of what had happened during the 43 minutes between takeoff and landing. "Ghost," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Got a question." She looked up from the paperwork, nodding that he had traded his combat equipment for the kind of casual uniform that indicated he was officially off duty. "Shoot." "Why'd you take the mission?" he asked. "Command had other pilots available, birds in better condition. You could have said no." The question was fair, and Ghost considered her answer carefully. The truth was complicated, involving career motivations and personal challenges, and the kind of professional satisfaction that came from successfully completing missions that other people considered impossible. But there was a simpler truth underneath the complexity. "Because you needed extraction," she said finally, "and I was available." Rodriguez nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Heard stories about you before tonight. Thought they were exaggerated." "They probably are," Ghost replied, returning her attention to the paperwork that would close out the mission officially. "Most war stories get better with age." "Maybe," Rodriguez said, standing to leave. "But not tonight's story. Tonight's story is going to be told exactly like it happened." He paused at the door, looking back at the pilot who had brought his team home through mechanical failure and hostile weather. Because sometimes the truth is better than the legend. After he left, Ghost finished her paperwork and walked through the base to her quarters, passing maintenance hangars where crew chiefs were working on the aircraft that would fly tomorrow's missions. The storm had passed, leaving the Afghanistan air clean and cold, while overhead the stars provided navigation references for pilots who were still airborne somewhere in the operational area. Her reflection in the quarters window showed a pilot who looked older than her 32 years, marked by the kind of experience that comes from flying helicopters in places where the margin for error is measured in seconds rather than minutes. But there was something else in her reflection now, a satisfaction that came from earning respect through performance rather than reputation. The mission would be debriefed tomorrow, analyzed for lessons learned and tactical improvements that could be applied to future operations. The Black Hawk would be repaired or retired, depending on the assessment of damage that extended beyond tonight's mechanical failures. Rodriguez and his team would return to their unit, carrying stories about a pilot who had extracted them from hostile territory in an aircraft that had no business being flyable. But tonight, Ghost was simply tired, satisfied, and ready for sleep that would come easily for the first time in weeks. Because she had flown a mission that reminded her why she had become a pilot in the first place, and had done it with passengers who had challenged her to prove she was worthy of their trust. The respect of special operations personnel couldn't be faked, purchased, or inherited. It had to be earned through shared risk and demonstrated competence, one mission at a time. Tonight, Ghost had earned that respect, and the knowledge would sustain her through whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Outside her window, the lights of Bagram Air Base provided a small circle of security in a country that had been at war for longer than most of its inhabitants could remember. But inside that circle, American forces were planning and executing missions that would eventually bring them home, carried by pilots who understood that success was measured not in medals or commendations, but in the number of passengers who walked away from their aircraft at the end of each flight. Ghost had carried 8 souls home tonight, including herself. In the mathematics of combat aviation, that represented a perfect score, the kind that made all the mechanical failures and weather challenges and professional risks worthwhile. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that the stories told about Ghost Rider pilots were based on performance rather than mythology. But tonight was complete, successful, and worthy of the reputation that would carry Ghost's call sign to the next mission, wherever and whenever that might be. The base settled into the kind of quiet that passes for peace in a combat zone, while Ghost fell asleep to the sound of distant helicopters carrying other pilots and other passengers through the Afghanistan darkness. The war would continue, but tonight's battle had been won, one extraction at a time. Morning brought the after-action briefing that would officially close the books on Ghost's mission, but it also brought something unexpected. A request from Rodriguez for Ghost to be assigned as primary aviation support for his team's upcoming operations. The request carried weight because SEAL Team 7 could choose their own aviation assets, and their choice of Ghost represented professional endorsement that was more valuable than official commendations. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison read the request with the kind of attention he reserved for personnel decisions that could affect operational effectiveness. Rodriguez had documented his team's assessment of Ghost's performance with the kind of detail that suggested he understood the significance of his recommendation. "She's solid," Rodriguez had written in his official report. "Aircraft handling, tactical awareness, decision-making under pressure. Team recommends her for extended support role." But Morrison had also read the maintenance report on Ghost's aircraft, which documented mechanical failures that should have grounded the helicopter hours before she attempted to fly an extraction mission. The combination of outstanding piloting and questionable judgment created the kind of personnel challenge that made squadron command complicated. "Ghost," he said when she reported to his office for debriefing, "maintenance says your bird should never have left the ground last night." She had expected the conversation and had prepared her response carefully. "Yes, sir, but the mission required accepting calculated risk." "Calculated risk," Morrison repeated, his voice carrying the kind of tone that preceded either commendation or disciplinary action. "Chief Warrant Officer Henderson says your tail rotor was throwing vibrations that would have grounded any other pilot." "Yes, sir," Ghost replied, "but Chief Henderson wasn't responsible for extracting 6 SEALs from hostile territory." The honesty in her response was refreshing, even if it highlighted the tension between mechanical safety and mission accomplishment that defined combat aviation. Morrison had flown enough missions to understand that pilots sometimes had to choose between following technical regulations and completing their assigned tasks, and that the best pilots were those who could navigate that choice successfully. "Rodriguez wants you for permanent aviation support," he said, sliding the paperwork across his desk. "Says his team trusts you." Ghost read the request with surprise and something that might have been pride. Trust from special operations personnel was not given lightly, and the fact that Rodriguez was willing to stake his team's effectiveness on her performance represented recognition that transcended normal pilot-passenger relationships. "What's your assessment, Ghost?" Morrison asked. "Can you fly missions with Team 7 without getting them killed?" The question was blunt but fair, and Ghost appreciated Morrison's direct approach to what could have been a complicated personnel decision. She had proven she could extract Rodriguez's team under adverse conditions, but sustained aviation support would require different skills and different kinds of risk management. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Team 7 operates in environments where standard aviation procedures don't always apply. I can adapt my flying to match their operational requirements." Morrison nodded slowly, recognizing the careful phrasing that acknowledged both capabilities and limitations. Ghost was volunteering to fly missions that would push the boundaries of standard helicopter operations, but she was also indicating that she understood the difference between calculated risks and reckless endangerment. "Assignment approved," he said finally. "Effective immediately. Rodriguez is briefing a new operation for next week. You're his primary pilot." The meeting concluded with handshakes and paperwork, but Ghost left Morrison's office knowing that her career had shifted in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Flying dedicated support for a SEAL team would provide challenges and opportunities that differed significantly from her previous assignments, while also carrying responsibilities that extended beyond normal pilot duties. Rodriguez found her in the flight planning room 2 hours later, studying topographical maps of the Kunar province area where his team would be operating. The terrain was challenging even by Afghanistan standards: steep ridges, narrow valleys, and landing zones that existed more in theory than in practice. "Heard Morrison approved the assignment," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Team's looking forward to working with you." Ghost looked up from the maps, nodding the careful phrasing that indicated Rodriguez was still evaluating whether she was the right fit for his team's operations. Trust earned through a single mission was different from the kind of sustained professional relationship that would be required for ongoing support. "What's the mission profile?" she asked, focusing on operational requirements rather than personal considerations. "Direct action," Rodriguez replied, spreading additional maps across the table. "Targets a high-value individual who's been coordinating attacks against coalition forces. Intelligence says he's holed up in a compound about 40 miles northwest of here." Ghost studied the terrain around the target area, noting the elevation changes and potential landing sites that would allow insertion and extraction of Rodriguez's team. The mission would require precision flying in mountainous terrain, probably at night, with tactical considerations that would limit her options for approach and departure routes. "Insertion here," Rodriguez said, pointing to a saddle between two ridges about 3 kilometers from the target. "Extraction from the same location, or from alternate sites if the primary becomes compromised." The plan was tactically sound but mechanically challenging, requiring Ghost to navigate through mountain terrain in an aircraft loaded with personnel and equipment. The margin for error would be small, and mechanical failures like those she had experienced during the extraction mission would be potentially catastrophic rather than merely dangerous. "What's the timeline?" she asked. 5 days, Rodriguez replied. "Team needs time to rehearse approach routes and contingency procedures. You need time to study the terrain and plan flight profiles that will get us in and out without alerting half the Taliban in Kunar province." The compressed timeline was typical for special operations missions, where intelligence windows and tactical opportunities often provided limited planning time. Ghost had flown similar missions before, but always as part of larger aviation packages that included backup aircraft and alternative extraction assets. Flying solo support for Rodriguez's team would require different kinds of preparation and different risk assessments. "I'll need weather data and intelligence updates on enemy air defenses in the target area," she said, making notes on the margins of the topographical maps. "Also want to coordinate with the maintenance section to ensure we have an aircraft that won't fail at a critical moment." Rodriguez nodded, appreciating Ghost's attention to details that could determine mission success or failure. The best special operations personnel understood that successful missions resulted from careful planning as much as tactical execution, and Ghost's focus on aircraft reliability indicated she understood the connection between mechanical preparation and operational effectiveness. "Team briefs tomorrow at 800, he said, gathering up the maps. "You'll meet the rest of the operators who will be flying with you." After Rodriguez left, Ghost remained in the planning room, studying terrain features and elevation data that would determine her approach to what was shaping up to be the most challenging mission of her career. Flying solo aviation support for a direct action mission required skills and judgment that differed significantly from the extraction operations she had previously flown. The difference was that extraction missions were essentially defensive, bringing people home from situations that had already developed. Direct action missions were offensive, requiring pilots to insert teams into hostile territory and then remain available for extraction support while the operators accomplished their assigned tasks on the ground. Ghost pulled up weather data for the target area, noting wind patterns and cloud cover that would affect her ability to navigate through mountain terrain without using radar that could alert enemy forces to her presence. The mission would require flying at low altitude through valleys that provided limited maneuvering room, while maintaining the kind of tactical awareness that would allow her to respond to changing ground conditions. Her personal experience with direct action missions was limited, but she had flown enough training exercises to understand the basic requirements. The challenge would be adapting her flying style to support operators whose mission success depended on precision insertion, reliable extraction, and aviation support that could respond to tactical developments in real time. The planning session extended through the evening and into the early morning hours, as Ghost worked through contingency procedures and alternate flight profiles that would provide Rodriguez's team with maximum tactical flexibility. By dawn, she had developed a mission plan that balanced mechanical limitations with operational requirements, while identifying risks that could be managed through careful preparation and tactical awareness. The team briefing began at 800, with introductions that revealed the kind of professional competence that Ghost had come to associate with special operations personnel. Each operator brought specific skills and experience that would contribute to mission accomplishment, while also serving as backup for teammates whose primary responsibilities might be compromised by tactical developments. Doc Thompson was the team medic whose skills extended beyond trauma care to include advanced life support and emergency surgical procedures. Longshot Williams was the sniper whose leg wound from the extraction mission had healed sufficiently to allow his return to duty. Tank Martinez was the breacher whose expertise with explosives and entry techniques would be essential for accessing the target compound. Each operator had participated in dozens of direct action missions, and their questions about Ghost's aviation support revealed both professional curiosity and the kind of tactical awareness that comes from experience in environments where mistakes have permanent consequences. They wanted to understand her capabilities and limitations, while also assessing whether her flying style would complement their operational approach. "What's your experience with direct action support?" Tank asked, his question carrying the weight of someone who had been extracted from compromised landing zones by pilots whose skills ranged from exceptional to marginally adequate. "Limited," Ghost replied honestly. "Most of my missions have been extractions and resupply, but I've studied the tactical requirements, and I understand what you need from aviation support." The honesty was appreciated, even if it highlighted gaps in her experience that could affect mission effectiveness. Rodriguez had briefed his team on Ghost's performance during the extraction mission, but direct action support would require different skills and different kinds of decision-making under pressure. "Primary concern is noise discipline during insertion," Rodriguez said, addressing both his team and Ghost. "Target area is populated, and early detection could compromise the entire operation." Ghost nodded, understanding that her approach profile would need to minimize acoustic signature while maintaining the kind of flight path that allowed quick departure if ground conditions required emergency extraction. The balance between stealth and tactical flexibility would define much of her mission planning. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering contingency procedures and communication protocols that would coordinate aviation support with ground operations. By the time it concluded, Ghost had developed a clearer understanding of her role in the mission, while Rodriguez's team had gained confidence in their new pilot's preparation and tactical awareness. But the real test would come during the rehearsal flights that would allow Ghost to practice flying in terrain similar to the target area, while giving the SEALs experience with her flying style and communication procedures. The rehearsals would reveal whether the professional trust that had developed during the extraction mission could be sustained through the more complex requirements of direct action support. Ghost spent the afternoon conducting reconnaissance flights over training areas that replicated the terrain and tactical conditions she would encounter during the actual mission. The practice flights revealed both capabilities and limitations that would affect her performance when the mission shifted from training to operational reality. Her aircraft handling in mountainous terrain was precise but conservative, favoring mechanical reliability over aggressive maneuvering that could stress aircraft systems beyond their design parameters. The approach was tactically sound, but limited her options for responding to unexpected developments that might require rapid changes in flight profile or landing zone selection. The rehearsal flights also revealed communication procedures that worked well for coordination between aviation and ground elements, while identifying potential problems that could arise if tactical conditions required rapid decision-making without extended radio coordination. Ghost and Rodriguez developed abbreviated communication protocols that would allow quick coordination during time-critical phases of the mission. By the end of the rehearsal period, Ghost had developed confidence in her ability to provide effective aviation support for Rodriguez's team, while the SEALs had gained experience with her flying style that would make the actual mission more predictable and therefore safer for everyone involved. The night before the mission, Ghost conducted final aircraft inspections that verified mechanical systems were operating within acceptable parameters, while Rodriguez's team completed equipment checks and reviewed contingency procedures that would govern their actions if ground conditions differed from intelligence predictions. Ghost found herself in the unusual position of feeling nervous before a mission, not because of mechanical or tactical concerns, but because she was flying with a team that had specifically requested her support based on a single previous mission. The professional trust was gratifying, but it also carried pressure to perform at a level that would justify Rodriguez's confidence in her abilities. The mission brief began at 300 with weather updates and intelligence reports that confirmed the target remained in the suspected location, while also revealing increased enemy activity in the surrounding area that could complicate insertion and extraction operations. The tactical picture was challenging but manageable, requiring Ghost to adapt her flight plan to account for enemy positions that had not been present during rehearsal flights.